Yeah, this is a challenging one. The whole question of how immediately is God at work in a natural disaster? And I think when it comes to the larger question of what are natural disasters, how do they relate to God's will and God's purpose, the place to start there, I believe, is Romans chapter 8, where we read about not just human beings affected by the entrance of sin into the world, but all of creation. Paul is very clear about this. All of creation subjected to futility. In other words, there's no part of creation that's unaffected by the entrance of sin and God's responsive judgment on that sin. And so Genesis 3, God curses both man and creation. It's important that we remember in Romans chapter 8 that when Paul says all of creation is subjected to futility, he talks about the one who subjected it. God himself subjected all of creation to futility. And so there's no corner of the universe that's not affected. The world, the earth in which we live, is now, how do you say it? It's skewed, it's affected, it's laboring under a way of being that God did not originally intend it to be. And that by itself is a sufficient explanation for natural disasters. The earthquake, the cyclone, the hurricane, name even some of these recent disasters. Romans chapter 8 is by itself a sufficient explanation because all of creation is groaning, subjected to futility by God. But I would just add to that, beyond that sufficient explanation in Romans chapter 8, we do see God at times very directly intervening. Both Old Testament and New Testament, we see God at times using what we would call natural disasters as a way of judging. You think whether it's the 10 plagues poured out on Egypt, on Pharaoh in particular, or whether it's the storm that God sent to judge Jonah, other people affected by that, but that is God's very specific intervention, or whether it's the locust plague that Joel talks about in the book, the prophet Joel. You see it in the New Testament as well. There are times when God very specifically intervenes. So while I would say that Romans 8 is a sufficient explanation, we don't want to factor out the possibility, the ability, and in fact, the history that God has used direct intervention. Now, from our perspective, it's hard to know what was that, the earthquake in China. What was that? We don't stand in a position to know. All we know from Scripture is that creation subjected to futility, and God has the ability and at times will intervene directly in judgment.